Thrive family, I hope that the last 2 weeks walking through this story-formed way has helped you to understand and to see the world a little bit differently. We have been trying to lay a foundation so that we can be fluent in the gospel. So we know what the gospel actually is and how we can both articulate it to other people and how we can apply it to our own lives. That's the goal. The reason that we're going through the story-formed way and setting this foundation is so that we can have a biblical worldview. What in the world is a worldview? A worldview is how we make sense of the world and all that we experience in it. So you might have a question like, why do bad things happen to good people? Well, from the last 2 weeks, you should be able to answer that question. And so maybe as we're walking through it, you've been thinking about these things, and maybe you haven't. Maybe you've caught on to some of the golden threads that are going to tie this whole thing together. Maybe you've missed it. What I want to do is do a brief recap for you to make sure that all of us are all on the same page. So if you look at the first narrative, what we went over 2 weeks ago, if you talk about creation, what we see is that God's design for the world was what? Over and over again, the narrative in Genesis 1 says, it is good. God would create something, and at the end of the day, he says, it is good. So if you take nothing else away from the first narrative, you should know that God's design for life is good. And then we get to man. And he says, what about man when he makes him? He says that he makes him in his own image. And when he is done and he has created man and woman, it is very good. Well, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? Well, I can think of several things that are in that narrative that help us to understand what it means for us to be made in God's image. We see that God is a relational being. Over and over again, you may have caught this, you may not have. The pronouns that are used are plural. So over and over again, when God refers to himself, he says we and our. So what we know is that the Trinity was present at creation. So Father, Son, Holy Spirit, all there. And that God in the Trinity is in perpetual and eternal relationship with himself. And man is created and he's all alone. All he has is him and God. And what does God say? God says it's not good for man to be alone because he's made in my image. Therefore, I'm going to create one corresponding to him that will be a helper. And so he creates woman. And so we know being made in the image of God means that we are relational and that we need relationships. The second thing that you might have noticed is it says be fruitful and multiply. That we are to multiply and be fruitful and create, and that's an amazing, incredible thing. The third thing that you might have noticed was that God gave mankind the ability to choose, right? He puts the knowledge of the tree of good and evil in the center of the garden by the tree of life. And so the tree of life, when they ate from that, they would live for eternity. But the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he asked them to not eat from that. And because they were something that they were not supposed to do, what we know is that mankind, Adam and Eve, were designed with the ability of choice, or what we might call free will. The final thing that you can take about being made in the image of God is what we see is that a God that works. That every single day he was creating, he was building, he was working, and he had dominion or control over all that he created. We know that God is completely sovereign and in control over everything that happens. But then he says he asks man and woman to have dominion, to rule over the earth, to name the animals, and to take care of the garden. So to be made in the image of God means that we are designed for relationship, that we have free will, that we you get the picture. So all of those things. And it was good. It was very good. God's design was so good. And then we see in the next week, brokenness enters the picture, that mankind chooses to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Eve, she comes along, and the serpent is there. He tempts her. He says, did God say not to eat the tree? And she says, I'm not supposed to eat that. He says, God didn't say that. And he begins to sow some lies in there and say, if you eat from that, he doesn't want you to eat it because you'll be like God. And so she takes a bite and she gives it to Adam, and he takes a bite, and their minds are opened, and now they have the knowledge of good and evil, and they realize that they are naked and they feel shame. So anytime that we sin, anytime we deviate from God's design, we can know that we will experience brokenness, and piece of that brokenness is that we will feel shame. And so they try to cover themselves, they hide from God. God comes along, he's looking for them, and they say, we're hiding because we're naked. And God says, who told you that you're naked? And we see that Adam blames Eve, Eve blames the snake. And so anytime there's brokenness in the world, we see blame and shame occurring when you deviate from God's design. What that should tell us in a biblical worldview sort of sense is that one, that all humanity was created to be good. It was God's good design. Every man, every woman, every child are created good. The second thing that we should realize is that we have all been infected and affected by sin. And so none of us actually are good. And so you might ask that question, like, why do bad things happen to good people? Well, one, sin is in the world, and we have free will and the ability to choose. And so why do bad things happen? Well, oftentimes because men and women make poor choices that are outside of God's design, and the result of that is brokenness. But that wasn't God's plan. He's a loving God, he's a kind God. He didn't want that for our lives. And even within the second narrative, we see that God says that one day, one like the Son of Man will step and stomp the snake. And so we know that there is hope for a future, that there will be someone that will rescue us from the effects of sin. And so the rest of the Old Testament, from Genesis to the end of the OT, what you see is mankind, what God will come in. He reminds them of his design for life. He gives them a pattern, he gives them a covenant, he gives them laws, and what they choose to do is to make themselves like God, to ignore those rules. They experience brokenness. They experience the consequences of those sins. They experience shame and blame, and then God comes along, they go back to his design, and there's this cyclical pattern that shows us that man can't save himself, that he needs someone or something to come along and save him from the effects of sin. That's what we're going to talk about this week. We are going to talk about what the Bible shows us is redemption, how we can be set free, how we can be made right so that we can enjoy relationship with God, live inside of his good design, and have a life that is thriving and flourishing and amazing. So I can't wait to see what God does in your group this week.